Welcome to the From Guilt to Good podcast, where we discuss all the things caregivers wish people would talk about, but don't, won't, or can't. Hi, my name is Jeanette Yates. I'm the founder of the Caregiver. I cared for my own mother for several decades and now help caregivers set boundaries and use simple tools that make care and life easier so they can feel good, not guilty. And in today's episode, I welcome to the show Jermaine Ee. He is a founder and storyteller obsessed with how we spend our time, the work we do, and what we leave behind. He's currently building HeirLight, a simple and smart will maker that turns avoided conversations about family, money, and legacy into legally binding documents. And we need to have this conversation, Jermaine, because like we've already talked about, a lot of people don't like to talk about this kind of stuff. And that's part of the reason why you created the app, which we'll get to in a minute. But first of all, I just want to say welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So one of the first questions I always start off asking every guest is if they have any personal caregiving experience or any caregiving adjacent experience that they might want to share with our audience. We always like to let our listeners and watchers know, hey, we've been there.
I feel very lucky. So I'm 34 and my grandma is 91, 92. We sometimes forget her age as she gets up there. And she has dementia. And for the past 4 years, I've gone to see her basically once a year. She lives out in Malaysia. That's like 8,000 miles away from Los Angeles where I live. And I've come to really appreciate the time that I have with her from a understanding me point of view.
Yes.
And I'll elaborate on that because now her memory's back to her teenage years and I can see her worldview, like how it's formed. And it's so cool to be able to see like all the things that affected how she formed her worldview. And in turn, she raised my dad. So how my dad's worldview this kind of influence. And so I find it really fun and, to get to really know her. But on a lighter note, because her memory doesn't work so well anymore, she loves watching soccer or for the rest of the world, football. And she loves watching a few matches. For example, when Germany destroyed Brazil in the World Cup many years ago, she loves watching that. But because she doesn't remember what happened, every time she watches it, she gets the same amount of joy. And so I'm waiting for, the 7 times Germany scored. And I film her every time because her face lights up and it's incredible.
First, thank you for sharing that because I feel like we could stop the episode right now and we've gotten something so incredibly important, which is you sharing about your relationship with your grandmother, how you stay connected with her, and then just the things that you are noticing that you can be happy and joyful about, even in the midst of something that, is devastating in many, many ways, but that you're able to find that things to look forward to and get excited about. So thank you for sharing that. And I know that when we talked previously, your experience may not look like mine in caregiving, but you do have this sense of understanding multiple generations, things that people deal with when they're dealing with caring or overseeing the care of a loved one. And so, that is something that you bring to your experience with HeirLight. But I want you to talk more about what what is HeirLight, and then what made you want to start it?
I like to say HeirLight is the representation of who I am as a person. In some ways, it's like, all my 20s, this insecure guy in his 20s was just thinking, if I'm successful, I'll be loved. If I'm successful, everything in the world will be fine, right? And I was chasing all these ideas and things like that. But as I kind of develop a sense of who I am as a person, which is family is very important to me, the kind of conversations I like to have every day is mostly about how do we maximize the time that we have here while not going bankrupt, because there is a version of life where we outlive everything, but then we look back and think, well, we actually didn't build any foundation for our lives, be it professional or anything. But HeirLight came to me at a moment where, my parents and I, after COVID, we decided to spend a lot of time together. And so we moved into an office space where I'm sitting right now. And our goal was to just be around each other more. Our goal was to work during the day and then maybe go to gym together after work and try to optimize the amount of time that we have together. And in this process, I was able to spend a lot of time talking to them about things that typically we don't find time for, things that are important but are not urgent. Things like, what was your hobby when you were 18 years old, and why don't you do that anymore? So things that you got to like dig through a little bit. And one of those conversations I had with my parents was about retirement. So they are in their early 60s. Well, my mom was. She passed away 7 months ago in August. And what I realized was that, is my mom didn't really have this anxiety around retirement. Her anxiety was more around the fact that she doesn't know what she has right now or what she had at the time.
So the
And what I
unknown.
realized is like, if you don't know what you have, how could you possibly feel good about where you're going? Or
Yeah.
what's enough in by extension. And so before it was HeirLight, before it was estate planning, it started as a chatbot to essentially ask my mom these questions. For us, there was a little bit of a language gap because even though she speaks English fine, but she communicates the best in Mandarin. And so the chat was able to do that, right? We're able to capture all this information. And in a few months, I realized if I had the things that are most important to you and the people who are most important to you, with a little bit of organization, I'm able to actually generate a legal document to essentially reflect those wishes that you have, that you've told me. And that's where the idea of HeirLight started.
Well, what I love about your origin story, if you will, for HeirLight is that it started with conversations. And I think that, especially when we're this season on the podcast, we've been talking a lot about technologies in this area of, for people that are hitting this phase in their lives where they need to start thinking, probably should have already started thinking, but definitely need to start thinking about things like this, planning. There's a lot of technology being marketed to caregivers, to aging people, and to have people coming into the space creating tools that started with the human, that started with the conversations, that started with real life connection is, I think, something that we need to celebrate. And I think that's also going to be the key to successful tools, right? Because they are grounded in, things that we actually use and need. What I really love about HeirLight, so for those of you listening and watching, it's really HeirLight it's spelled HEIR, so like the air, okay? Your heir to whatever, right? But you really make it very simple. And does it work? You mentioned that like in the original iteration, it was really just a chatbot. Is that how it works for if I sign up for it? Is it just going to have a conversation with me and then develop something? Can you talk us a little bit through how that works?
Yeah, I actually, before I get there, I want to touch on the fact that, when I started this thing, I thought, of course, everybody wants to have a conversation that
Right.
becomes a will because it's so human. It's so easy. But I realize, some people want to have a checklist. Some people want to have something more rigid, and some people want to have forms. And where I'm kind of at right now is the rising tide raises all boats in this industry. I think all the tools out there that came before me, those are just as important because they paved the way to start this conversation. And of course, I learned a lot from them because I see the gaps that the people that drop out after using them for a while. Why do they drop out? Why are the retention so low? But this is where we come in, which is our goal is that you can have a human like conversation with a chatbot, and in the
Mhm.
back of it, the chatbot is remembering everything about you. It's building like this profile. So the first thing you come in, because all 50 states have different estate planning laws, the first question we ask you is, where do you live? Because we got to anchor your entire profile to that.
Right.
And then we start asking you the key questions. For example, do you own a home? Do you have kids? All right, things like that kind of shapes the way we build out your profile. And then we provide you with two paths essentially. The first path is if you want to just have a chat about things. So we program it to ask you some questions about your life. And then the second path, which is our promise of letting you walk away with a legal document. And that process is a little bit more rigid. We ask you questions. And then while we're asking you questions, we define all the terms for you. And you can always ask it, what should I do? And that's where we kind of have to draw the line because we can't give you legal advice. But what we can do is to lay out all your options and let you choose. And if you don't understand the options, we're able to explain it to you.
Mhm.
And our goal is just to treat it as best as a conversation as possible. The key difference is without the judgment, right? If you if you show up to a lawyer's office, and this is something I realized as well, having done this for the last year. I thought that estate planning, the reason why people don't do estate planning is because a lack of resources or money. But we have users who clearly have the resources to hire an attorney, and we try to reach out to them to understand their motivations. But what I realize is that some people just don't want to talk to another human. Some people don't want to sit across from another human and say, I am 60 years old and I don't know what an executor is.
Right.
And I underestimated how human that is. And so it shocked me, why people use our app. And so yeah, our goal is to turn that conversation that you have into the legal document. So we'll ask you clarifying questions. And I'll just put this out there too. ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, these tools are great at many things, but they're not good at drafting legal documents for one reason. They're very general, and they don't ask you enough context of who you are. So when it's so general, they're generating documents based on what they can find in the internet to predict what is the best document for you, not necessarily what is the one that will be legally valid for you. And so what HeirLight does is we don't search the internet at all, actually. All our backend is lawyer reviewed to the state that you live in, right?
Yes.
So we make sure that a lawyer has looked at everything that we output, and then we just kind of match it to the conversation that you have with us.
Well, and another thing that HeirLight does that isn't available on the more generalized large language models is that you have a level of security, bank level encryption, things like that, where there's some protection there for people who are telling about their estate, about their belongings and where they live and all this kind of stuff. And so I think for a lot of times people that are on the layperson side, that everybody is telling us about AI and tools and chatbots all the time. And it's easy to just lump them all under the same thing. Like everybody calls every chatbot ChatGPT when it could be Gemini or could be, it's like, and so understanding that there are different ways to teach the model, the different models that you can have different security measures and all of those kind of things. I think that is something that as a layperson, it's not, I've worked in technology long enough to know these things, I just know them, but a lot of people don't. And so I think it's really important as people have tools that have these technologies that use some of these things that we think we might know about because we've heard about it, or we use ChatGPT to help us with our recipes, how this is different, how this is more geared toward your actual needs and goals as a person trying to figure out, to your point at the beginning, you talked about how do I even know what I have so that I know how to plan? So I know we don't, learning how to get the answers to those questions cannot be really adequately done just with a generic tool. So just making that general statement for those my non-techie listeners that are like, what are they talking about? So I just wanted to reiterate that you do have, like you said, you have a back-end trained lawyer reviewed by state, which is very important, like you mentioned, but then also there is this level of protection. One of the things that we also talked about was the overwhelm that it, before we got on here, and then I think in our messages, but one of the things that we want to make sure that we highlight is this, what are the things that you have noticed that keep people from starting this conversation? You mentioned that some people just don't want to have a conversation with another human, period. And you mentioned judgment from the perspective of going to a lawyer and having them make you feel stupid because you don't know all the terms. But I imagine even when it's not a negative thing, even trying to have these conversations with family members, there can be a certain level of expectation, or is maybe the right word, maybe judgment isn't, but maybe sometimes it is. But there's that extra layer of the emotional part of it when you're trying to have that conversation with families, that maybe by using a tool like HeirLight, you're kind of breaking down some of the unknown. So do you want to talk a little bit about the overwhelm and that kind of piece?
Yeah. In this field, let's call it an industry or a field, it's not like a lack of tools, or
Right.
there's definitely not a lack of attorneys out there. It's actually this 0 to 1 problem. It's like the first step problem, right? All of us are, all the apps and all the tools out there and all the free resources, we all have the same challenge, which is the inaction. Because at the end of the day, how do you market something and how do you talk about something that is not top of mind? It's not urgent until it is. And
Right.
also, depending on generation and cultural, religious, regional differences, people may not want to talk about death.
Yes.
And I always say that the first conversation is often with yourself, right? It's like to really look inside, and that's what I try to do it for my mom. I when I built this app, I think a lot about what would my mother do, what would help her the most, and it's hard for her to have a conversation with me, or we're really close. Like, can every time I have a thing, it's only like it's been 7 months, so every time I have a question, I can just close my eyes and I imagine what my mom would say, and I'm pretty close to it. I'm like, I almost know what the answer is. And even people that are this close, the challenge with her having this conversation with me is that she never sat down and thought about it herself. And if all else doesn't work out, at least HeirLight can do that for you, right? We're able to have a conversation with no judgment, where you can go in and feel very confident that whatever you ask us in HeirLight, we're going to tell you to the proper legal definition, like,
Hmm.
what can I do with these things? And then we're going to present you with like the 5 options. It's actually really funny that we have this thing, the healthcare directive or the advance directive, depends on what state you live in. It's essentially the document that says if you cannot make medical decisions for yourself, like if you're in a coma, who can, right?
Hmm.
And every state, many states have very different requirements.
Very
You can
different.
actually say, I want my internals to be donated, or my externals, or my limbs, or there's so many different categories. And no one in their normal life think about these things. We don't walk around thinking about, gee, I wonder what would happen. Do I want to be kept alive with tubes or something like
Right.
that? So we try to break down these conversations into very manageable chunks. And we ask you these questions one by one and define them for you one by one, so that when you do have this conversation with someone you love, you've already have this baseline comfort with it.
Right. Right.
Right. And I think like the conversation should shift. Let's say we're having it with a parent. Instead of saying, I want to know what you want, we should say, I want to know what you'd like to happen with things and your body, not we need to talk about your will. Because we need
Right.
to talk about your will is like a legal document. It's just the output of it.
Right.
Yeah, I had a trust set up with my family for my mom, and it was so overwhelming when she passed. And actually, we're still dealing with it.
Right.
The county assessor is still asking for some documents about our property and things like that. I just cannot imagine if you don't have any of these set up,
Right.
just to have to grieve and to deal with this at the same time. And yeah, I really want to help, take a stab at this problem, no pun intended, and try to.
Well, and as you were talking, first of all, I also, you and I talked about this too, where, we both lost our moms in the last year and around the same time. And so it is still like I can really everything you were saying about just, like you can hear them and know what they would say to you. And of course, my mom and I were very, very, very close. But one of the best gifts, and my situation was different because she got sick when I was so young. And so, if at anything, I was over prepared for all the questions, all the times that I had to whip out my power of attorney or a medical surrogate or my, like, because I had gone through those conversations with her so many times. But I will say that at the end, when things started getting to where we were needing that paperwork more often, and then into her last days, and then afterwards, I was able to know exactly what was going to happen with everything because we had set that up 10, 15, 10, 12 years before. And so it is worth the uncomfortable conversation, but using tools like yours can help make the conversation less uncomfortable. To your point, another thing that's really good about it is, just being able to let your loved one, if they're able to, right, have that conversation without you at first. Just answer these questions that this is going to ask you. And then I think is a much easier on ramp than sitting down at the table and trying to have, one of many conversations. Hopefully, hopefully it's more than one conversation.
There's also, I always tell people, I have to admit, building this app is very difficult. You know, we
Yes.
we have days where we don't get a new user for like 5 days in a row. And we're thinking, is our messaging wrong? You know, we think about these things all the time. And one of the things that keeps me really grounded with this, and I just done edit this video of me going to Oklahoma with my mom last May. And, you know, through these conversations that we have, I realized one thing, which is she'd been thinking about going back to Oklahoma where she started, where she first landed in the United States in the 70s, late 70s. And you know, there's so many things that we think we know about the people we love, but because we're also busy with our lives and they are busy with their lives, we tend to put off a lot of the important things. And I didn't realize how important it is to my mom, or it was to my mom, to go visit Oklahoma. She just wanted to see where she started 40 years ago in the United States. And so, with this process of talking to her about these topics, I just realized, what are we waiting for? Why don't we just go? And so last May we went. Me being me, I filmed everything. I mic'd her up, and I'll share this with you, and you can link it down below if you want.
Yeah, I will. I will.
Section. And essentially, you see us walking around Oklahoma, and I ask her about questions. And I'll share something here that didn't make the cut of the video, which is, you know, when she was working at a restaurant, her English was, she barely spoke English at the time, and she talked about how she was bullied by people who purposely wouldn't tip her because she was seen as someone that could be bullied and she wouldn't stand up for herself because she can't communicate that well. I kept that out of the video because I just thought the way she said it was, you can see it in her eyes, it was very personal, and I didn't want to put it out there in the internet. But it's these stories that I realize if we don't consciously ask and document, you know, these stories will go away, and they kind of shape who we are as people and how we see the world. And for me, I'm just so grateful that while building HeirLight, I was able to be in the zone of like making my mom feel more seen,
Mm-hmm.
right? She
Mm-hmm.
never got to use the app, but she got to feel the effects of HeirLight because she's who I built it for. And I'm just so grateful that I was doing that.
I'm getting emotional over here. The more you talk about your experience, and thank you for sharing that about your mother. My mom was a wonderful storyteller. She told stories, and she was considered by our family the keeper of all of our family stories. And so it was very, very important to her to pass down as many stories as possible. And so I recorded them and wrote them down. And of course, I'd heard some of them my whole life. And so, like, they're just ingrained in my brain. And then I remember, like, as she was going, I thought, oh, there's so many more stories I didn't get, you know, like there's always more. But I do think it's the stories that matter, which makes me feel like HeirLight is really a storytelling app that will give you a will afterwards. Like, it just, I don't know, that maybe not what your marketing team wants to say, but like, it just sounds more like, you know, that's where your heart was when you were building it, is the storytelling part, the asking the right questions part, the connection piece, and that to like you say, to give something that's actually beneficial, that can help both the person and their loved ones after they're gone, is so vital. And I know that's what everybody wants too. They don't want to leave their families high and dry, or, you know, not knowing the answer to the questions, right? So um
Well, you're looking at the marketing team and you're spot on. It's me. Yeah, I always say we, you know, in a perfect world, we are a storytelling company that happens to do estate planning.
right. Yeah.
And
There's
and
your
I think the
winning message, Jermaine. That's it.
the work you're doing, you know, it's just sometimes we talk about the same things all the time, and I've been doing this the last 6 months, and I feel a little tired of my own voice. And you know, I'm like, gosh, I'm saying the same stories over and over again. But I have to keep reminding myself that even for me, there was this random Gary V clip on Instagram this weekend that hit me super hard. And you know, we hear him on the background, he's everywhere.
Right.
But once in a while, something stops you and it hits harder because you just, where you are, your mood, where that story landed with you, it hits differently and it moves you to do something. And it just reminds me that, you know, this is why we do what we do, right? It's why you keep recording these and putting this out there, because all it takes is one person to be listening to this at the right time to change like how this entire end of life is for a family and maybe for generations to come. And yes, estate planning can be very complicated. You know, you layer on top of tax strategies and things like that. But everybody has to start somewhere. And I'd like them to start at a place where they feel confident and comfortable, ideally talking to HeirLight, and on their own pace as well.
Yeah. Well, speaking of connecting with HeirLight, I've obviously will link it in the show notes. It's heirlight.com, right? I was just about to say that, heirlight.com. And you can go there in the website, you guys, if you're listening or watching, it's really easy to, it's not overwhelming. It literally starts with a question, like, who are you doing this for? So very easy to just go and engage with as much as you want. Maybe just reading the front page will, is enough for today. But I highly encourage you to check out what Jermaine has been working on. As you can tell, this is not a gimmick for him. This is something that he built to, for his mom, in honor of his mom, and wants to help all of the people who use HeirLight to learn more about their life, their loved one's life, and connect so that they can have the resources that are important to them. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience before we sign off?
Yeah, one thing that hit me really hard during COVID was this chart that was made popular. And the chart essentially just shows, the time we have with our parents. So if you flip it around, time you have with your kids, that 90% of the time we have with our parents would have been spent by time we're 20 years old. And by time we're 30 years old, 95% of all the time in our lifetime that we would spend with our parents is behind us. And so I'm going to guess most of us are over 30. So probably we're in the 5% left. And I just challenge you to sit down and think about how you want to spend the last 5%, right? Think about the times that make you happy, that you go back to often. And think about, actually, most of these things are probably very simple, right? They don't require a grand trip, a big gesture. And most of it are really simple. And I would challenge you to do more of that in the last whatever percent you have,
Yes.
Whether it's your kids or your parent.
Yes. Well, Jermaine, this has been a great conversation, and I could ask you a million more questions. But I really appreciate you sharing so openly about your experience with both your grandmother and your parents, and you talking about your inspiration and hard work that you have put into building HeirLight. And again, everyone, I will link the website, and then if we get that link to the video, we'll share that as well that he was talking about, where he documented his trip with his mother. That's going to be amazing. I can't wait to watch that. But thank you, Jermaine, for joining me today. And thank you for joining me today on the From Guilt to Good podcast. Like I said, to access all the additional caregiver resources, support our show, and connect with us on social, check out the show notes. We are changing the conversation around caregiving one episode at a time.